Hello friends, my name is JJ, and like many people, I was fairly surprised by Donald Trump's re-election last week. Trump's win in 2016 was also a shock, but was a much more narrow victory and could even be dismissed as a fluke of the electoral system. But this victory was unambiguous and decisive, which also makes it a much more meaningful thing for political commentators like myself to seek to analyze and understand. And one of the ways that I have personally been doing that is by trying to understand the consequences of Trump's re-election from a Canadian perspective. So today, I'm going to offer you guys a few of my initial thoughts, both in terms of how Trump returning to power might affect the character of Canadian politics, as well as the US-Canadian relationship more broadly. I think that a second Trump presidency has the potential to affect Canada considerably more than the first one did, so let's talk about why. But first, a quick word from today's video sponsor, Scentbird. Hello friends. So in the aftermath of this stressful election season, you might be looking to do something nice for yourself, maybe engage in a little self-care. Now, I have never gotten that into cologne, but I've always been meaning to give it a try, just because it can be quite attractive on other people. Well, this is where our friendly friends at Scentbird can help out. Scentbird is a subscription service that delivers a little 8 milliliter vial of fragrance to your house every month. And for your first shipment, they give you this charming little plastic container that you can put it in for easy spray-ins. This is a great way to get into fragrances if you're like me and find the whole process a little intimidating, just because you're not dealing with that much of it, and the price point is quite low. You only pay $8 for your first shipment and then $16.95 for every subsequent one. And once you feel like you have gotten enough cologne, you are free to cancel at any time with no consequence. So let me tell you about some of the specific ones that I got. Souvenirs du Tunisie by Véronique Gabay. I like the cologne, but not all of the French, I have to say. According to the helpful card that came with, this one has notes of orange blossom, bergamot, neroli, sandalwood, and almond. And then this one is really fire. Wish You Were Here by Memory, with notes of summer rain, toasted almonds, and fresh ground coffee. It reminds me of some of the sexy dudes that I dated when I was in college. Scentbird is a big company based in New York. They offer fragrances from all of the major perfume companies and even do crossovers with brands like Marvel. If you're interested in beginning your scent journey with your first shipment only costing $8, no shipping, and free plastic case, just scan this QR code or click on the link in the thing below. Explore a world of fragrance with Scentbird. So a big reason why the American presidential election is being studied so closely here in Canada is because we will be having our own prime ministerial election in less than a year's time. As we know from my recent award-winning video on the topic, the Canadian election is currently scheduled for October of 2025, but it is possible it could wind up being several months earlier if the Parliament votes no confidence in Prime Minister Trudeau, or if Prime Minister Trudeau just decides to reschedule it earlier, as he has the power to do. Which leads us into the first question to ponder: what does Trump's victory mean for Trudeau? Prime Minister Trudeau is quite unpopular right now, and is widely expected to lose his bid for a fourth term whenever the election winds up happening. And for a long time, it seemed like the only thing that could possibly alter this fate would be if some big, dramatic thing happened that radically altered the Canadian political landscape in his favor. Does Trump returning to the White House rise to that level of an event? I used to think so, but now I'm not so sure. If Trump had been elected in a very narrow way, like he was in 2016, I think it is possible that Trudeau could use the shock of that victory to make himself look more attractive by comparison. You know, a symbol of Canadian stability in contrast to the wild fluctuations of the American political system. If Trump then proceeded to use his thin mandate to govern in an extreme or cruel or chaotic way, it would be similarly easy for Trudeau to portray himself as a calm and compassionate alternative. And Trudeau could paint his rival, Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre, as basically a Trump in waiting who would inflict a similarly destructive style of government on Canada. And yet, I now feel it is easier to second-guess some of those assumptions. The fact that Trump won as decisively as he did makes it clear that a lot of Americans were very hungry for change. They didn't trust their incumbent administration. And even though it was pretty obvious all of the ways that the leader of the out party would be an agent of chaos and pain, it still wasn't enough to persuade voters to turn against him. You might have seen this chart from the Financial Times going around. It illustrates how in every election held in every major country around the world this year, the governing party has seen their share of the vote decline, leading to a broad wave of losses for incumbents. And this tends to be framed as the grim final act of the COVID era. Most countries experienced a lot of economic hardship during the pandemic and its aftermath, and their ruling parties were accordingly punished by voters at the first chance that they got. Both Canada and the US experienced high levels of inflation due to government attempts to mitigate the economic fallout of the COVID crisis. And I feel like it has already become conventional wisdom in many circles that Trump's re-election should be primarily understood as an expression of anger at the high cost of living this inflation produced. For the last few years, Canada's economy has been consistently performing worse than the US, especially when it comes to inflation and cost of living. So if post-COVID economic pain is indeed the defining issue of the Western world, there's basically zero reason to expect Trudeau to be able to pull off a victory under these conditions when no other world leader was able to. Now, a lot of Canadians really do not like Donald Trump, though probably less than is often assumed, which we will discuss more later. But in any case, the fact that his re-election was so upsetting to so many people up here makes it, on the one hand, perfectly rational for Trudeau's campaign to seek to portray Pierre as a kind of mini-Trump. But on the other hand, we have to remember that Prime Minister Trudeau will also have to work with President Trump in the months leading up to the Canadian election. And this might make the Prime Minister a little bit wary about making overtly anti-Trump politics part of his personal brand. I mean, preserving the stability of the US-Canada partnership is basically the only real goal of Canadian foreign policy. So why bother provoking a president known to be, let us just say, a little bit sensitive? Trump had a basically good relationship with Trudeau the first time around, certainly better than he had with many other world leaders. But Trump is now under greater influence of men like Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson, who hate Trudeau quite openly, in part because they see him as being indistinguishable from the American left, which of course they hate with the fury of 1,000 suns. The guy who Trump appointed to be his new national security advisor has likewise been quite outspoken in his opposition to Trudeau and support of Pierre. Again, because a lot of American conservatives have come to understand Trudeau as an enemy they recognize. We even saw a glimpse of Trump's anti-Trudeau radicalization during the campaign when he spouted a notorious anti-Trudeau conspiracy theory during his live stream with Aidan Ross.
Yeah, he's turned very liberal, actually. They say he's the son of Fidel Castro, and could be. I mean, anything's possible in this world, you know? I get along with him very well, actually, but he seems to be going very progressive.
Trump has also promised that he will level tariffs on all foreign goods, which Trudeau will have to try to talk Trump out of during his renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Deal, which is something else that Trump wants to do. So when we consider all of this, there is probably less political space for Trudeau to turn the Canadian election into a referendum on Trump per se. Trudeau will probably be more keen to portray himself as someone who knows how to handle Trump and point to the trade agreement that they negotiated in 2018 as proof of their good working relationship. If anything, I think it is very possible that Trudeau could face some flack from Canadian progressives and the further left New Democratic Party for not going after Trump hard enough in his re-election campaign. You can imagine him being in a sort of difficult pincher type scenario where people on his left will want him to denounce Trump explicitly, while people on his right will be super critical of anything that he says or does that's seen as threatening Canada's US interests. He experienced something similar when he ran for his second term in 2019, the only other election he has faced while Trump has been in power. Now, of course, the US election wasn't just about Trump. It was also about Kamala Harris. Trump didn't just win, Kamala also lost. And the lessons of her loss will have to be internalized by Trudeau and his Liberal Party because they occupy a similar space in the Canadian political context as Kamala and the Democrats did in the US. One particular analogy that we've talked about a few times in recent months is the question of whether Prime Minister Trudeau is basically in the same position that President Biden found himself in back in July. Biden, of course, was also quite unpopular. And after a terrible debate performance, a consensus emerged among Democratic elites that he should step down and let someone else lead the party in its campaign against Trump. And he did, and Kamala Harris took over, but the Democrats still lost anyway. And it's for that reason that I suspect Trudeau is probably now less likely to resign and let someone else take over the Liberal campaign, as some in his party had previously been demanding. Trudeau might be as unpopular as Biden, but no one is questioning his lucidity, so the objective necessity of him stepping down feels less urgent in that sense, especially if the potential downsides of him doing so are now clearer. For example, the fact that no one voted for Kamala became such a popular criticism during her candidacy will surely give Trudeau's Liberal Party some pause. Even though there is enough time for the Liberals to elect someone to replace Trudeau in a competitive party primary, in a way there wasn't for Kamala, in Canadian politics, it is tradition for the Prime Minister to resign the Prime Ministership altogether when the incumbent party wants to run somebody new. I've always hated this tradition because I think it cheapens the office of Prime Minister. And voters tend to agree, which is why Prime Ministers who get the job this way don't usually proceed to win elections. But the point is, if no one elected Kamala was a convincing rebuke against someone who didn't even get elected as a candidate, just imagine how much stronger it becomes when you're using it against someone who was never elected to be Prime Minister, but somehow wound up in charge anyway. On a more cynical note, if Trudeau was to step down, it is quite possible that the person who replaces him could be a woman, maybe even a woman of color. And, you know, while we can never know for sure how much that played a role in Kamala's defeat, it was probably more than zero. Fair or not, I think that the resentment factor can increase a lot when a progressive party is seen as imposing a DEI hire candidate on the public, which is a good transition into another major theme that has defined analysis of Trump's win, which is this whole question as to whether or not progressives have gotten too obnoxiously politically correct or woke, as we now say. Despite all of the retroactive declarations that inflation was the dominant issue of the presidential race, a lot of pundits have also given a lot of praise to Trump's decision to spend so much time campaigning with big online influencers like Aiden Ross and Theo Vaughn and Joe Rogan and the rest. These guys are all right-wingers and symbolize the growing influence of the political right on social media. But they also practice a form of conservatism that is not primarily concerned with economics, small government, or even government policy in general. Instead, they offer resistance to progressive social movements like feminism and trans rights, and speculate about the various conspiracies that the elites are cooking up to impose these ideologies on our schools and movie theaters and all the rest. Kamala Harris didn't run against Trump on a super woke platform, but in her earlier political career, she definitely said and did enough woke stuff to give people like Elon Musk material to use in some pretty vicious attack ads against her. Justin Trudeau is kind of the opposite story. He didn't run on a super woke platform when he was first elected in 2015, but he has grown more preoccupied with social justice stuff the longer he's been Prime Minister. And yet, up until now, his conservative rivals have resisted making too much of some of the things that his administration has done or funded as it relates to, say, transgender accommodation or anti-racism initiatives, or especially his very grand and expensive efforts to atone for the plight of the Native Canadians, where he has probably gone the most furthest left and most postmodern. Trudeau's immigration policies have grown quite extreme as well, though in recent months he has begun to walk some of them back and has started to introduce immigration cuts after raising rates to record highs. So you could say that there are already signs that he is starting to feel a little bit self-conscious about the degree that he is testing the public's limits with his cultural agenda. And I think that this fact, coupled with Trump's victory, makes it likely that Pierre is going to start going much harder after Trudeau for being too woke, with Trudeau increasingly defensive on some of these issues in a way that he is not used to. Which brings us to Pierre. What is he going to learn from Trump's victory? One of the most dramatic takeaways of the American election was that Trump has made the Republican Party much more competitive basically everywhere, with even stereotypically liberal states like Illinois, New Jersey, and Maine being way closer than anticipated. He also proved to be much more popular with minority voters than many might have expected, given his propensity for making bigoted statements hasn't exactly slowed down. Among others, he made significant gains with Black, Hispanic, Asian, Indian, and Arab voters. Now, Pierre Poilievre is a much smarter, more disciplined, less authoritarian politician than Trump, but they do have a fair bit in common. They both have quite fierce, combative personalities. They both have an intense dislike and distrust of the mainstream media. They both tend to favor really harsh, judgmental language when talking about their political enemies, and they are both prone to seeing the world in a somewhat conspiratorial sort of way. And these qualities have traditionally been seen as a liability for Pierre in the same way they have for Trump.
He is a panicked, incompetent, failed prime minister who is not worth the cost, the chaos, and the corruption.
If Trump's win had been less decisive, or if Trump had lost, you could see Pierre coming under pressure to be a bit more delicate in his words, a bit more worried about the consequences of saying the wrong thing or offending this or that group. But if letting Trump be Trump worked so well in America, I suspect letting Pierre be Pierre will be considered a perfectly viable campaign strategy in Canada. Now, some Canadian progressives will reply, oh, but Canadians are just a fundamentally nicer, more liberal people than Americans. And maybe that's true, but there is also an increasing amount of evidence suggesting that a lot of Canadians do, in fact, hunger for the nastier, more aggressive type of politics, too. I mean, we can just look at Trump's own growing popularity in Canada, for one. A recent piece in the National Post by my pal Tristan Hopper noted that Trump is the most popular Republican presidential candidate among Canadians in quite a while, particularly among young men and Conservative Party voters. The National Post is among a handful of conservative slanting newspapers and websites in Canada, and during the presidential election, these publications were mostly all pro-Trump as well. When you look at the most popular podcasts in Canada, meanwhile, you see a lot of people listening to MAGA guys like Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson. Likewise, here in British Columbia, we had a rather dramatic provincial election last month in which the BC Conservative Party, which has languished on the fringe of our politics for many, many decades now, came roaring back and came within a hair of winning power. And they did this by running a pretty aggressive anti-establishment campaign against crime, drugs, and wokeness. It was actually our election that made me think Trump might have a better chance at retaking the White House than I previously thought, just because if a stereotypically progressive place in the Pacific Northwest, like British Columbia, could almost elect a populist conservative government, anywhere could. The last thing I want to touch on is just the future of the US-Canada relationship with Trump in the White House in a more geopolitical sort of way. As I mentioned earlier, Trump was reelected on an even harsher anti-trade platform than the last time, vowing to impose enormous tariffs on all foreign imports. This is the sort of wild, Trumpy proposal that world leaders will now scramble to talk him out of on a nation-by-nation basis. And Canada is almost certainly in the best position to get this resolved quickly, just because the Canadian economy is so deeply integrated with the US in the way no other countries is. I mean, the most valuable things that Canada trades with America are half-finished cars to Detroit and crude oil to Texas refineries, both of which supplement rather than threaten American industries. And Trump knows this on some level because, as I also mentioned earlier, Trump and Trudeau renegotiated a North American free trade deal in 2018 that strengthened and preserved the fundamentals of this relationship. What I do wonder about, however, is to what extent the third party in this arrangement, Mexico, is going to be of much interest to Canada going forward. It is now pretty clear that America's relationship with Mexico is completely dysfunctional, with the Mexican border crisis in particular being another thing that helped elect Trump. And I've noticed that a growing number of Canadian elites are accordingly starting to question why Canada's crucially important trade relationship with the US is in any way linked to the Mexico-America relationship, especially since Mexico is a relatively minor trade partner of Canada. The other day, Premier Ford of Ontario called for Canada to ditch Mexico and negotiate a new bilateral US-Canada only deal of the sort we had in the 1980s before NAFTA was created. And I suspect that that is an idea that is going to be growing in popularity over the next little while as Mexico reemerges as a great foe of the Trump administration, and its standing as a useful ally correspondingly declines in Canadian eyes. And I have to say, this is an idea that I'm actually quite into, as somebody who would like to see Canada and the US establish a much more expansive 21st century bilateral trade and labor agreement, or BLT. I'll probably make a video just about this at some point. I didn't want Trump to get reelected, but sometimes it is only in a moment of crisis that we allow ourselves to think in new and creative ways. And I hope that for whatever stresses and difficulties a second Trump term brings to this continent, the people of Canada and the United States somehow find a way to grow closer despite it. Maybe that's a bit naive, but I don't know. But I would be curious to hear how you guys think Trump's re-election will affect Canada. Do you think it helps or hurts Trudeau? How about Pierre? By 2028, do you think Canada and the US will have grown closer or more distant? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.